Okay, let's bring on our next speaker. Bamise is an ESG analyst at Morrison Foerster in San Francisco. They're a longtime supporter of WCS. She researches and analyzes ESG regulations, develops compliance policies for clients, and integrates ESG diligence in investment and M&A. She is a Nigerian-trained attorney with experience in law and public policy and advises clients on environmental and social obligations. She received her L.L.M from Duke University in 2021, where she was awarded the Jury Howitz Scholarship and served as the L.L.M 2021 commencement speaker. Please welcome Bamise.
Got gold on my necklace, gold on my wrist. Gals getting mad cause the boys wanna kiss. Fast with the cash, I just throw it in the bag. Everything I wanna have, well I think you get the gist.
Thank you, Anandi, for the very kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. My name is Bamise. Like Anandi said, I'm an ESG analyst at Morrison Foerster's San Francisco office. Before I start my presentation this morning, I would just like to give a bit of a background into how I came into sustainability myself. It was 9 years ago. I was writing my undergraduate thesis, and I decided to research indigenous women and their commercial objectives in their traditional knowledge and also their social rights. Essentially, my research was to see whether women could concurrently pursue commercializing their indigenous knowledge and also protecting their social rights. And the research made me to understand that, unfortunately, a lot of times, indigenous women had to choose either their commercial objectives or pursuing their social rights. And oftentimes, they would pick, social rights because there were certain expectations of women. And so after this, I decided to live in the communities with indigenous women. I spent time teaching women and children. I taught women about how to commercialize their indigenous knowledge, which is a type of intellectual property, and also how to, help their businesses scale. And I also taught children in the evening. And what I realized were that there were systemic issues within the communities that were impairing women's abilities to be able to scale their businesses. And so because of that, I started working with international organizations and a nonprofit that helped women negotiate trade transactions. So it was a time where the European Union had a new regulation that was opening up businesses so the regulation's impact caused a lot of focus to go into Africa. And I recognized that businesses were going into Africa, but not necessarily transacting businesses the ethical way. And so living in these communities helped me to understand the lived experiences of women, their intentions with their businesses, but the systematic impediments to them being able to pursue their commercial objectives as well as preserve their social rights. So in the communities, I helped them to negotiate trade transactions because in some of the communities I worked, women could not negotiate trade transactions, but because we were women coming from outside of the communities, we were able to negotiate for them. And because of that, revenues increased, monies were going straight to the women, as opposed to going through different stakeholders before it eventually got to the women. And my work in the community led me to decide to dedicate my career to doing mission-oriented work. And so I went and pursued my master's in international law and development policy, and that's how I ended up at Morrison Foerster. And what I do for our clients at Morrison Foerster is essentially help them do business responsibly by first looking into regulations in all the jurisdictions where we operate and helping them interpret what those sustainability-related regulations mean for their businesses. I help them develop ESG compliance programs, and I also help them with strategy, materiality assessments, and stakeholder engagements. And our social enterprise and impact investing practice offers cutting-edge services, if I do say so myself. And yes, we advise clients on new corporate forms. And what these corporate forms essentially does is that it helps our clients to be able to integrate mission and impact into the corporate anatomy of their businesses without having to go through the rigor of balancing fiduciary duties. So with the new corporate forms, the directors of companies have to balance their fiduciary duties as well as consider stakeholder interests. So I'm talking about the Delaware Public Benefit Corporations and California's Benefit Corporation, among others. Also, we assist with hybrid and tandem structures, and what these structures does is that they help companies leverage the efficiencies of the nonprofit structure and the for-profit structure to be able to integrate mission and impact objectives in their businesses. We advise impact investors on how to preserve mission in their portfolio companies and measure impact. We help with ESG and sustainability policies and new forms of debt securities. These are some of the interesting clients that we have worked with that have done very good work in the impact space. And our practice is led by Suze McCormack, who, if I do say so myself, is another leader in, with social enterprises and impact work. Suze has extensive years of experience working with companies in this space. And before climate or social considerations in businesses became popular, Suze has been working on this for over 21 years. So now to the crux of my presentation. Today I'm going to be talking about the importance of sustainability performance tracking and monitoring. I understand that many people are averse to the emphasis on disclosures and performance tracking because we feel like it detracts from real action. But if you stay with me, by the end of my presentation, you would understand why this is very important for companies to pay attention to. So when I say sustainability factors, I'm referring to environmental, social, employee matters, respect for human rights, anti-corruption, and anti-bribery matters as defined by the EU regulations. And the reason why I would be talking about regulations coming out of the EU is because the EU is increasingly adopting regulations that have ripple effects across the world. So if you're a company that has any sort of footprint at all in the EU, you will be covered by certain regulations, and regardless of size. So for example, if you're a small company in a bigger company's value chain, you would be impacted by the reporting obligations under these emerging regulations. 2023 was an interesting year in sustainability and ESG. As you would all know, it was the year of sanitization, standardization, and there was a lot of action from the pro and the anti-ESG and sustainability sides. Of all the things that happened, I would highlight just a few, starting with the EU CSRD reporting obligation. It's a regulation, like I said, has ripple effects, will cover big and small companies in the United States, for example, because of their value chain reporting requirements. There's also the IFRS S1 and S2 standards that were released. They are not regulations, they're voluntary standards that companies are using, and they integrate standards that many of us will be familiar with. So they integrate the CDP standards or the SASB standards that probably companies have been using till date. And increasingly, regulators are relying on the subject matter expertise that was used to form these standards, and certain jurisdictions have noted that they would be integrating these standards into their regulatory frameworks. I would also talk about the climate litigation, which was held in Montana. It was a first of its kind plaintiff victory where we saw that these plaintiffs went to the courts, and now increasingly nonprofits and individuals are leveraging constitutional law principles and legal remedies to bring action for externalities and seek damages. Then I would also talk about what happened in June with the Supreme Court effectively ending affirmative action and how that is increasingly affecting corporate DEI programs. And lastly, I'll talk about the anti-ESG numbers. So there's been a lot of pushbacks from the anti-ESG faction, and 240 bills were introduced in 2023 alone. In 2021 and 2022, there were only 37 bills. Last year saw a spike to 240 bills, but notably more of those bills have failed than they have passed. So that's a good one for the pro-ESG people. And so beyond ESG and sustainability being value-based concessions, something that the CEO liked, or employees are asking companies to do business responsibly, why is it increasingly important for companies to focus on doing business sustainably? The first is regulations, which is the most important and the key factor that companies need to pay attention to. Regulations are taking it from companies' hands to decide whether or not they want to do business responsibly. Now, it's increasingly going into regulations for companies to have certain guardrails in place to ensure that their businesses are not having adverse impact, and also that they are mitigating the risks and also maximizing opportunities. But there are also regulations that are disclosure-based. They're not asking companies to do anything. They're just saying, come and tell us how you're performing on climate. But what those regulations do without intending to do them is that if you now have to disclose, you don't want to put out, bad performance out there. And so because you have to disclose excellent performance that the regulations have not asked for, but you don't want to put out poor scores or like low performance for yourself. So it's compelling companies to be able to begin to think sustainably and they can, transition traditional businesses to be able to do business responsibly. There's also a cost. There's been a lot of focus on how much is it going to cost a company to embed sustainability considerations. But what we need to pay attention to is the cost of not doing something. And that takes me to like the risk. So there's ethical risk, regulatory risk, reputational risk, and also there's opportunity in doing business responsibly. So who is asking and what do they want? Everyone wants accurate information, transparency, accountability. They want to see how you're resilient to ESG and sustainability risks, and they also want to see how you're maximizing opportunities. But there are some nuances in what the stakeholders are asking for. So for example, regulators are sanitizing the market to ensure that if you're disclosing accurately to be able to help investors and consumers make the right decisions. There's also industry organizations asking for responsible products and services. Consumers before just wanted to see businesses do business responsibly. But increasingly today, beyond you saying that you're doing business responsibly, they want to make sure that if you're saying that you're doing something, you're really doing it correctly. And so that's why there's greenwashing cases proliferating every other day. And there's your investors that need to see data on how you're performing for their own compliance, or also to see that their portfolio companies continue to align with their overall investment thesis and objectives. And increasingly, individuals and nonprofits are beginning to file lawsuits against the state and against companies for externalities due to corporate actions. And so what should you track? I would start with what you should identify. You should identify impact, risk, and opportunities. And what the disclosure standards are asking companies to disclose is governance. So what is the role of the board? What is the management's role in managing your impact, risk, and opportunities? And also with strategy, like what are the guardrails that you put in place? How are you thinking about this risk? How are you identifying, assessing, and managing them? Then what metrics and targets, what are the KPIs that you're setting, and how are you tracking? And with risk management, it just has to do with like the processes and policies that you have in place. So now you know what to disclose, now you know how to like set guardrails and processes around it. What is important to disclose? You don't have to talk about everything. So it can either be based on single materiality or double materiality. Single materiality focuses on only the overall financial value of the company. So it wants to see how the IROs affect you as a company. So if your company is instituted in a place that is, vulnerable to like flooding incidents, would your company be underwater, and how would that affect your overall corporate value? But increasingly, regulations are rising out of the EU so the United States is largely single materiality, only focusing on the financial aspects. But what's happening in the EU is that they want to see the inside-out impacts, and they also want to see the outside-in. That is, how do these IROs affect you as a company? How do they affect your financials? But also, what are you doing as a company that can now create externalities for your ecosystem? And so, disclosure regulations like the CSRD requires the inside-out and outside-in reporting. California's climate accountability package, that's the 253 and the 261. These regulations came last year, October, and they became effective in January this year. And so regardless of what happens at the federal level from the SEC, companies now have to start tracking their emissions and also their susceptibility to like risks and opportunities. And lastly, there's the OECD guidelines. They're not regulations, but increasingly they're being integrated in regulations. And what they do is that they help companies make economic, environmental, and social progress and monitor them, and also provide guidelines on how to minimize adverse impacts on sustainability matters. And so now that you know what to disclose, you know what to identify, you know how to set guardrails, where do you go to for guidance? So these voluntary standards, protocols, and frameworks, most of them came before regulation, or they are what companies use between intervening times before regulations are passed. And what they do is that they increasingly, these standards are working together to make sure that you don't have too many disclosure standards, because that's expensive for like you to be able to imagine that you had to disclose under all 5 of them. Imagine like the infrastructure that you had to put in place in your company. So I'll start with the TCFD. The TCFD has recommendations on how companies should assess and manage these risks. And so that was what I talked about in the previous slides with governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. That was from the TCFD recommendation, and a lot of these standards now follow that framework. Then we have the IFRS that has the International Sustainability Standards Board. And what the IFRS is doing is that it's increasingly causing other standard setters to aggregate under it. And so like your CDP, your SASB, your integrated reporting, most of them are now coming under the IFRS. And that's how we have the IFRS S1 and S2 standards on sustainability and climate-related risks and opportunities. And what they do is that they're voluntary standards that companies can now use while regulations are pending to be able to track their performance. And then there's the Responsible Innovation Labs that helps early stage founders and investors integrate responsible business considerations in innovations from the onset. The RI Life standards, like for example, like their AI commitments, they largely cater to tech companies, and it's largely advised for tech companies to begin to look into their roadmaps and their commitments to see how to develop technological products responsibly. And lastly, PolicyLink is working towards standards that helps to provide guidance for companies on how to integrate corporate racial equity sustainably into their businesses. And lastly, now that you have decided, okay, we would make disclosures, it's important to know the rule of the thumb is either that you disclose, but if you're disclosing, you disclose accurately. And so whenever you're looking at your disclosures or you're putting data together, make sure that it's audited. You can get independent verifiers. Some regulations require independent verification, some don't. But again, the rule of the thumb is either to disclose or abstain. But if you're going to abstain, but if you're going to disclose, make sure that your disclosures are accurate. Thank you.